Good afternoon and welcome to IFC webinars. I'm your host, Richard Miller, and to a series of webinars presented with the Fire Life Safety section. Today's event, an introduction to low frequency audible alarm requirements in various codes and standards. This is an exciting opportunity for IFC and the Fire Life Safety section to collaborate with multiple industry partners in providing a series of webinars with today starting off with the first one. I'm your host and moderator. I'm an IFC staff member and retired fire captain from Virginia. Before we begin, Audible is being broadcast using voice over internet protocol through your computer, speakers, or headset. Please make sure that your speakers and headsets are turned on and that the volume is turned up so that you can hear, and your microphones have been muted for this event. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please contact IFC support at webinars@ifc.org or via the chat function, and we will try to respond to you as quickly as possible. There's a Q&A and a chat and potentially some handouts available. So that's in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. So please use that. You can start off by logging in and introducing yourselves. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and what your interest is. That helps us better inform the next group of individuals and also the participants in today's event. Some upcoming events for IFC, Fire Rescue Med, Community Risk Reduction Conference, where these series of webinars will actually be brought together in a 2-day pre-conference event in Arizona. So we'd love to have you participate in the CRRL event in Glendale, Arizona this year. And then we also have our Hazardous Materials Conference coming up in Baltimore, and then Fire Rescue International in August in Dallas. Today's Low Frequency Alarm Committee group is responsible for putting together this series of great webinars. We have a pretty big scope that we're working on with multiple partners, the National Home Builders Association, NFPA, Research Foundation, a lot of various industry partners that you're going to hear about and learn about. But it's really looking at what this involves with respect to low frequency alarms and how best we can ensure that the codes and standards are meeting your needs and as well as the population's needs. We have a series of experts that are going to be participating, so I think you're going to be really entertained and provided with great information. Today, I'd like to talk about our key presenter for today. Victoria Hutchinson is a Senior Research Project Manager for the Fire Protection Engineer and Research Foundation, which is an independent research affiliate of NFPA. She plans, manages, and facilitates research and support of the NFPA mission. Victoria is at the Research Foundation, focuses on hazards and protection strategies and emerging issues and technologies, and effectiveness and efficiency of various protection strategies on various populations. She also leads and works with the Fire Protection Research Foundation Detection Signaling Research Planning Council to create a research portfolio that delivers and is reflective of the data, information, and knowledge needs of the industry. I think you're going to find this a delightful presentation today, and I'm looking forward to participating as your host. Victoria, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you for being part of this great event.
Great. Thanks so much, Richard, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. So as Richard said, I'm Victoria Hutchinson. I'm with the Fire Protection Research Foundation as one of the project managers there. And again, this is one of the webinars leading up to this event in Arizona, so hopefully this is of value to you. But this is something that the foundation has been working on for decades. Actually, we have a lot of resources. We've done some research, recent work specifically on some of those at-risk populations, particularly the deaf and hard of hearing. So this will largely be geared towards that population and research and findings around that population and some of the alternative technologies that are coming out, and particularly the effectiveness of low frequency alarms. So that's what we're going to be focused on today. But just background in case anyone here isn't familiar with the foundation. So we are affiliated with with NFPA. As you see our logo, there's both the foundation logo with NFPA, but we are technically a separate independent nonprofit from the NFPA. But we were really founded to plan, manage, and communicate research in support of NFPA's mission, and really was started in the 1980s as a resource, just recognizing the needs and codes and standards for research to and data really to drive the codes and standards process in a science and data and information based landscape. So we were founded on that purpose, but we are affiliated and work very closely with the NFPA, but are independent of that process. So going to the FPRF process, we are very stakeholder driven. Everything that we do is based on what we hear as the needs of the industry. So you will see us out a lot at conferences, either presenting the research or hosting research planning meetings or whatever, just trying to get insight from the industry. And that's from technical committee meetings, different research planning groups, consortiums, other conferences and events. We also do annual calls for research needs. So what the needs of the industry are, whether that's from the codes and standards perspective or effectiveness perspective from technology standpoint, it's really what the foundation was founded for. Then we bring the industry back into the projects that help provide guidance, oversight throughout that process. So this is just kind of a graphic of how the foundation works. And each of us have a portfolio of projects that we manage. Key qualities of foundation research. It is an independent process, so completely independent of the codes and standards process, but we will make committees aware of any work that we do and make that accessible to the committees. It's a fully transparent process from conception of the project idea all the way through the results. Everything that we do is fully and freely accessible to the public. We've built a reputation of credibility and have a strong communication network in the partnership with NFPA. So driving into today, I just want to make you aware there is a large portfolio of research, particularly in support of NFPA 72, but there's also quite a large portfolio, particularly on low frequency alarms. If you want to dig a little deeper into some of the current and past work that we have going on, you can scan that QR code there. Again, today, a lot of what we're focusing on is technology performance and comparing it to other strategies, particularly for some of those at-risk populations, but there's a large portfolio of research and resources accessible to you that are all freely available. So feel free to use that code. Next slide here. So I also just wanted to point out a few kind of key studies in the low frequency space. We've done a lot several years back, some of that foundational research in terms of understanding performance of alarms, kind of optimizing the smoke alarm or fire alarm signals. We did work on, specific to older adults, high risk groups, so people with hearing loss or folks who are deaf. We also looked at alcohol impaired, other high risk groups and large groups of them. So there's lots of resources there. This is just a few of them that I pulled out just to specifically call out several of these throughout the presentation. Some of the findings of that will be, you'll see that come up later in the presentation today. The study that I'm going to specifically be focusing on is our review of alternative alarm technologies for deaf and hard of hearing populations. That was done in 2021, but just recapping that and kind of summarizing a lot of the other studies that we've done that was curated through that research as well. I do just want to point out that we did launch the FPRF Detection Research Planning Council back in 2006, and it's been active ever since. So it's a free process. I encourage you to be involved in that. It's really a way for us to hear the voice of the fire alarm industry. So I encourage you, if you aren't involved already, feel free to reach out to me after this. I'd be happy to get you involved and invite you to the meetings to kind of share, what the needs of the industry are. So just getting into this and kind of the background and purpose of the study that we did around the deaf and hard of hearing population. When you look into disabilities within the United States, there's around 57 million citizens, which accounts to about 18%, that are recognized as people with disabilities. And of those, about 38 million are recognized as having some form of severe disability. And then drilling a little deeper into that population in and of itself, about 1 of every 100 U.S. citizens over the age of 12 experience hearing loss. And those people are, people either classified as severe or profound hearing loss. So those are some terms that you'll see in some of the studies on effectiveness that we'll be covering, but those terms, severe is between 60 and 80 dBA, and profound is over 80 dBA hearing loss. More than 14 out of 100 U.S. citizens over the age of 12 experience hearing loss to some degree, and as we all know, as we age, that is likely to increase. But in terms of effectiveness of alarms on these populations and others, all of the effectiveness is even more so impacted when people are asleep. So that'll come into a lot of the studies that we discuss later on. So the problem that we started looking at for this study was that traditional fire alarms emit a high frequency sound to alert occupants of an imminent threat, but that's typically not appropriate for folks that are deaf and hard of hearing. And if you've been in this industry for a while, that's no surprise to you. But the questions that we really sought out to answer was, what are those other available alarm technologies for waking, sleeping people that are either deaf or hard of hearing? How and when are those effective at waking people who are deaf or hard of hearing? And then what are the regulations, certification, approval processes that those technologies are subject to? So, some of the ones that are more mature, including low frequency alarms, there's a lot more on that. It's increasing a bit with bed shakers, pillow shakers, but there's some others as well. So we'll review kind of the full scope of what we looked at, but then drill a little deeper into those that, there's more regulation around, more use, all of that. And I do just want to mention that the foundation, we did partner with Lund University on this, with Enrico Ronchi and Eric Smedberg, who are the authors of the study. So I want to give them credit for doing a great job on this study, but they weren't able to join us today. So the goal overall of this project was to develop resources and provide a review of the currently available alternative alarm and detection technologies, and provide a summary of their characteristics, use cases, regulations, certification, approval processes specific to this community of interest. So the approach that we did in terms of searching all of the literature out there, we did kind of a formal methodology in terms of identifying, screening, eligibility, and then determining whether it should be included in the study. So what we ended up looking for was the identified technologies, what's being used, what's in the literature out there that's being used to wake people who are deaf or hard of hearing, any kind of study to support the effectiveness of those technologies on that population, and then any negative effects on other populations or on that given population due to the use of that technology, any risks associated, and then what are the codes and standards related to the technologies, and what are the requirements around those. So in terms of the technological landscape, what we looked at, you can categorize these into 4 categories really: audible, olfactory, tactile, and visual. All of these are covered in the report of whatever research was available to support these. What we're going to talk about today is really in the category of audible, tactile, and visual, and even narrowing that down a bit more. There are a couple crazy ones in here. Surprisingly, there is literature on using electric shocks to wake people. That is not something that we encourage. It is in the report, anything that is being used. So some of those alternative things, the use of phones, the use of pagers, other things. They are included in the report, but what we're going to focus on today is the differences between high frequency and low frequency alarms on this population, and then primarily looking at bed shakers and pillow shakers, and then the data around strobe lights as well. So that will be the primary focus, but the full report is accessible, fully available to everyone, and it's a bit more broad than what we have time to cover today. So codes and standards, looking at where these alternative technologies are covered. Again, we don't really consider high frequency alternative, but just recognizing where they are. So what we're focusing on today is really the ones that are covered in the codes and standards. So that would be high frequency alarms, low frequency alarms, bed and pillow shakers, and strobe lights. There is a standard that leverages air movement devices, but that's not going to be one of the focuses of today's presentation. So here, this is just a chart. I know it's a bit of an eye chart here, and the text is quite small, but this is just a visual to help you see, which standards cover which technologies that were analyzed. So majority of them do cover high frequency alarms. If you look at the ones that covers bed shaker and pillow shaker here, the fourth line down, BS 5446. That one is specifically for deaf and hard of hearing populations for alarms. AS 1603 covers high and low frequency bed shakers, pillow shakers, and strobe lights. So a bit unique here. So I'll just kind of scroll through these just so you can see. I won't go into the details here. In the final report, I will have a link for you to download that. We do go into a bit more detail in terms of what the scope of all of these standards go into and cover, but we'll save most of the presentation today focused on the effectiveness, which is kind of the crux of the project. You'll see here, NFPA 72 covering high and low frequency bed shaker, pillow shaker, and strobe light. And I'll keep going on. There's some standards from FM as well, the IBC, and then here are some of the UL standards as well. So UL 1971 is signaling devices for the hearing impaired. So that's the one that covers air movement there, also covers bed shakers, pillow shakers, strobe lights, so more of those alternative standards there. And then you have some of the usual suspects here with UL 217, 268, and others. So again, won't spend time here, but I encourage you to go to the report to see a bit more in terms of regulations there. So digging into the effectiveness evaluation, I want to start with some of the core technologies. So this is really compiling from the literature what studies and testing have been done on these populations. In some cases, I compare it to able hearing populations as well as kind of a baseline comparison. But most of this work that I'll be presenting here is based on folks that suffer some form of hearing loss or are deaf. But there are some terminologies here and characteristics of these experiments that are pretty true across the board. So that's, human sleep cycles and stages of sleep. So that will be indicated in most studies. How deep of a sleep were they in, when they were woken to the alarm? What are the characteristics of the alarm tone? So that's, the type. Is it high frequency? Is it, low frequency, the 520 hertz? What is the presentation of the tone? Is it continuous? Is it intermittent? Same with vibration for bed shakers or whatever it may be. And then characteristics of the test subject. So is it, male, female, old, young, alcohol impaired? There's other variables there, and I'll clarify that in all of the studies that we walk through. So here, some of the variables, this is specific to sleep cycles and stages, so you may see some of this terminology throughout the rest of the slides. So I just wanted to cover it. This terminology was standardized back in the 1960s, but you have stage 1, 2, 3, and 4 sleep. So stages 1 and 2 are fast wave sleep, stages 3 and 4 are slow wave sleep. And then you'll hear the terminology random eye movement, REM sleep. So the slower wave is a deeper stage of sleep, same with REM. The brain waves are measured by electromagnetic not going to read that whole word. They call it EEG. And then there are differences, distinct differences in what the brain is doing at each stage of sleep. So that's really important variable to really compare these against in terms of the overall effectiveness and what was that stage of sleep and some of those other characteristics. The audible alerting threshold, that's an important term to recognize as well. You have a minimum SPL that wakes a sleeping test subject, then waking in that deep level of sleep is more difficult. So a greater alerting threshold will be needed in comparison to REM sleep. Most testing is done with a standard like 1000 hertz pure tone. But again, some of these experiments vary from that. And typically 60 to 70 dBA was accepted as like the baseline alerting threshold in most of the studies. So a couple other things to keep in mind that varies in the research that we present is the tone, pitch, and complexity of the alarm tone will vary, and we will try to define that in each of those scenarios. In the presentation, this did show to really have a big impact on the overall effectiveness. So the fixed intensity, or if you did kind of a step increase in intensity, so that sometimes allows more in the population to wake to the signal. Duration of the signal had a big impact, or the time period to the stepped intensity as well played a role, and also kind of how it was delivered to them. Then the last thing is the test subjects themselves. So you do tend to see quite a bit of difference between children and older adults, and there's some variances with gender as well. Hearing status obviously plays a really huge factor. So we'll define, if they are hard of hearing, what that hearing loss range is, or if they're deaf, if they're severely or profoundly deaf. So all of that will be indicated. Again, there are some studies, mental status, were they alcohol impaired or anything like that. So, and then prior instructions and knowledge of, what the test was going to entail. Those are sometimes included as well. So I just wanted to give some background in terms of kind of what the bounding conditions and terminology were from most of the studies. So now I'll start going into the different alarm technologies. So starting with high frequency, this is just kind of a high level synopsis of what we found. So technology description, this is widely known to everyone, makes use of a high frequency sound, generally incorporated in the smoke detection device, typically over 2000 hertz. A lot of them are typically around 3000, 3100 hertz. Use and availability, obviously this is the most widely used technology out there, but typically it's most effective on normal hearing adults. So on the deaf and hard of hearing population, it does have a limited effectiveness and really is not effective at all for people who are deaf. One of the undesirable consequences of this, and kind of one of the reasons that we wanted to look into some of these alternatives for this population, or for those at risk, is people on the autism spectrum. This can cause them to get disoriented. It's also not as effective for at-risk groups like children or alcohol-impaired population. So some of the studies that substantiate this, this is a study done by Ashley and Du Bois several years back, but it's comparing hearing population to hard of hearing population to deaf population, and also comparing high frequency to low frequency. So we'll talk about low frequency in a minute, but there is 111 subjects in this study. Again, a varying range of hearing ability. They tested a 3100 hertz alarm and a 400 to 500 hertz alarm, so the low frequency tone, both around 80 dBA. So this showed that for the able hearing population, 92% woke to that alarm, so very effective there. For the hard of hearing population, about 57% awoke to that. But for the deaf, we found 0 people of those 33 that were tested in that group woke from that tone. So the greater there is in terms of hearing loss, you see severe reductions in overall effectiveness. So the next study here, just continuing on a bit, this one focused specifically on older adults between the ages of 65 and 83. This is done by Brock and Thomas several years back. But what you can see here is that AAT, or the median audible arousal threshold on the low frequency signal, was significantly higher than the high frequency tone, by about 20 dB, 45 and 65 dBA respectively. So you can see the blue line there is the high frequency tone, and the red line there is the low frequency. So you can really see a big gap there in terms of overall waking effectiveness. About 18% of the subjects slept through the high frequency alarm at 75 dBA, but in comparing that to only about 5% sleeping through the low frequency harmonic. So no surprises there in terms of overall effectiveness. This is another graphic from another study by Brock and Thomas here. So just showing the overall kind of percentage of effectiveness of that high frequency tone in comparison to the low frequency. So pretty big differences there in terms of waking effectiveness. Moving on to low frequency, the technology description makes a use of low frequency sound around 520 hertz that's integrated into a smoke detection device. In terms of use availability, it is available in integrated or standalone devices, but a lot of times those standalone devices include more than one stimuli other than the low frequency tones that could be a flashing light or bed shaker or other things. So the research is very supportive of its effectiveness for people with hearing loss. Again, for those that are deaf, the effectiveness is fairly limited, but significant improvement over the high frequency tone for that population. Generally speaking, what you'll see in the research results here is that it's really broadly much more applicable to all populations, and we're not seeing much undesirable consequence as a result of the use of that tone. So going back to that study that we looked at just a moment ago, but looking at it from the low frequency side of things, so looking at the 400 to 500 hertz alarm that was put out at 80 dBA. So in terms of the deaf population, this is where we see, again, it's still low. We only had 2 people awaken, but there was some movement there for the deaf community, which is a positive sign compared, jump up to 11% compared to 0%, which is positive. The hard of hearing populations, it was 92% effective for those populations, which is really encouraging compared to the 57% for high frequency. And then for the able hearing population, 100%, we reach 100% waking effectiveness for the hearing adults. So overall, the low frequency tone was found to be much more effective across all populations, and across all, including deaf, we found the overall effectiveness to be about 90%. So another study conducted by Brock and Thomas, they investigated a 520 hertz and a 40 hertz square wave signal in a T3 pattern at different sound pressure levels. So there's 38 participants in the study, a little more females than males. You can see the split there. The median age of that test group was around 54 years old. Their hearing loss ranged between 20 and 70 dB. And they were evaluated at different hertz there, as you can see. So for the 520 hertz signal, it was found that individuals awoke at these following breakdown. So kept increasing the intensity a bit, but between 55 and 75 dBA, about 92% percent awoke to those tones. At 85 dPa, another one participant awoke to another 3%, and 2 more awoke once it was elevated to 95 dBA. But there were 0 people that slept through all sound pressure levels at that 520 hertz tone. The 400 hertz tone was found to be a little bit less effective just in comparison to the 520 hertz, but still overall had fairly good effectiveness. Another study by Brian back in 2014 investigated a low-frequency 520 hertz square wave and voice enunciation device. We're not clear on what the sound pressure level was in this study, but it was all with profoundly deaf patients, and 19 folks were involved in that. Only 2 of 19, so again, all severely deaf. Only about 10% awoke from a REM sleep when exposed to the low-frequency alarm, which is pretty consistent with the work of Brock as well. But again, getting some waking, effectiveness from that group from this is more positive than from some of the, in comparison to the high-frequency tone. This study here was waking experiments with a low-frequency tone for the alcohol-impaired. So we had 32 adults involved in the study. Between 93 and 100% were awoken by that 400 to 500 hertz harmonic tones at 75 dBA. In comparison, the 3100 hertz smoke alarm only woke about 61% at that same decibel level. So you can see much greater effectiveness on that alcohol-impaired population as well. Both of the low-frequency tones performed well and very, and clearly better than the pure 500 hertz tone or the recording of the smoke alarm. But there weren't any major differences, as you can see in the up here in the chart. There wasn't any significant differences observed between the 400 and 520 hertz harmonic tones. So those are the 2 black dotted lines on the chart there. So moving on to bed or pillow shakers. So here, this is something that has really gained a lot of momentum, particularly with the deaf community, as an alternative to standard alarm. So this can be described as a device that's connected to or placed at the bedside table that detects sound of a regular smoke alarm and activates the bed or pillow shaker upon detection. It does have wide availability from multiple manufacturers. It tends to be the preferred choice when alarm clock functionality is integrated with it, and it's one of the most widely used things, according to the literature, for the deaf and hard of hearing community. And it does have pretty strong effectiveness in terms of the studies and evidence to support that. But it does seem to be less effective for older populations, so that's something to keep in mind. But there haven't been any severe negative consequences affiliated with it. So I'll start. Most of the research is on bed shakers specifically, but there is a little bit on pillow shakers, so I'll cover that at the end. So there is quite a bit of work that's been done on bed shakers, particularly for deaf populations. So starting with one of the studies conducted by UL quite a while back. This involved bed shakers, which was essentially a cylindrical vibration device with a cylinder displacement of about 1/8 of an inch and a vibration frequency of about 100 hertz. So this device is placed under the pillow or under the mattress. The sleep stage was not controlled, but the subjects included about 20 deaf adults, 77 deaf children between the ages of 10 and 19. So of the adults, around 95% awoke from a 4-minute long presentation of the stimuli. And then for the younger children, it varied between 77 and 100%, depending on the age in terms of overall effectiveness. The thing that we have to consider today in our modern fire environment, this study was done quite a while back. We may not have 4 minutes, to respond. So response time to these alternative technologies becomes critically important in terms of the time that we have to get out of the home. So we'll get into that a bit later as well. So another small study, it was conducted with 13 college-age deaf students. There's about 13 participants. The specifications of the study was fairly limited. About 77% awoke from the vibrations from the variable bed shaker. So there does seem to be increasing performance when there's variability in the vibration from the bed shaker. Here, another study. This is specifically on hard of hearing populations, but Murphy and some others conducted experiments using a commercial bed shaker. There's 11 hard of hearing adults between the ages of 20 to 76, so pretty broad range there. And their hearing loss range from, slight to profound. So there's quite a bit of variability there. There's 16 young adult university students with normal hearing who wore earplugs to simulate their hearing loss. So overall, the results of this, about 87% of the hard of hearing population awoke from REM sleep when presented with that stimuli, 92% from the normal hearing population, which is what you would expect to be a bit higher there. From the slow wave sleep, so deep sleep, there's about 70% of the hard of hearing population woke from that type of sleep due to that stimuli, 76% for the normal hearing population. And then the hard of hearing group, it did point out that it did take them a longer time to wake up from the stimuli, with about 19% of them requiring more than 1 minute to get some movement as a result of that stimuli. So that's a really critical variable there. So some more work from Brock and Thomas. They conducted experiments involving 38 hard of hearing subjects between 25 and 70 dBA. They controlled the sleep to either stage 3 or stage 4 sleep. And then the bed shaker was used, just a commercial off-the-shelf bed shaker, but it was modified so that they could alter the intensity to evaluate the effectiveness if that is raised. So 28 of the 35 participants, about 80%, woke to the vibration intensity that came with kind of that commercial off-the-shelf bed shaker configuration. 9%, so 3 additional folks, woke to that stimuli when the intensity was raised, but 11%, so 4 of the 35, still slept through all intensity levels. And again, as we said, it tends to be a bit less effective for older adults, and this study showed that for those over 60, the effectiveness was reduced. So this study compared deaf and hard of hearing, both looking at a commercial bed shaker. So the intensity was not altered, but this one altered the vibration pattern of the bed shaker to be that intermittent T3 pattern. There were 26 able hearing adults involved, 22 with hearing loss between 25 and 90, and then 30 who were deaf. So the results from using both a continuous, the condition of the bed shaker as it was bought off the shelf, and then the intermittent vibration pattern showed that about 90% of the trials for the continuous bed shaker stimuli that had a little bit less effectiveness for the hard of hearing group, but the intermittent bed shaker awoke everyone involved in the trials 100%. So including those that were deaf. So that's really encouraging and kind of shows the intermittency of the vibration pattern really improved effectiveness overall. So another study by Brian did invest a intermittent bed shaker, 19 participants involved that were all profoundly deaf. They were exposed to the vibrating alarm during REM sleep. And this study showed that 100% woke when exposed to the vibrating alarm. And it did show that, the response time to the bed shaker did seem to be, did have a faster response time than some of the alternative technologies, so like the high frequency alarm and the strobe. So I'll show a bit more on that here in a few minutes. So this was the only study that we could really find on bed shaker that got through all of the testing. So much of the testing around bed shakers, a lot of times we ended up excluding the data from bed shaker or from pillow shakers, excuse me, because it was deemed non-reliable because it frequently moved out of place when it vibrated or it made loud noises. So it was unclear in terms of what actually woke the participants. So anytime there was uncertainty in the results, we kind of pulled it out and didn't include it in the study, and many of the studies excluded it from their own results. So there is a bit of limited data on this one, but in this particular study by Brock as well, had 38 hard of hearing subjects, 16 male, 22 females with hearing loss between 25 and 70 dBA. The sleep stage was controlled to stage 3 or 4 sleep, so still a fairly deep sleep. And the pillow shaker was used, it was just a commercial off-the-shelf pillow shaker, but it was modified so that the intensity could be altered. But here, at the commercial off-the-shelf configuration, about 66% of those participants did wake to that technology. When the intensity was increased a bit, 4 additional participants woke to it, but only 1 participant slept through all intensity levels for the pillow shaker. But keep in mind that there are some limitations to the studies with them just to the movement of the device in the trials. So the last one that I want to touch on in terms of effectiveness is strobe light. I know that there's been a lot of discussion around this. So I think we all know what strobes are, but it's a device used to produce regular flashes of light accompanied by audible alarms typically, and are particularly used in sleeping units. So they're activated by the fire alarm and flashes, and there's other it's wired and connected to the fire alarm system. So these are widely commercially available with many manufacturers globally, sometimes required in public buildings, especially in areas where people are expected to be sleeping. But there is some variability in terms of the effectiveness. Some of the older studies show some effectiveness, and some of the more recent studies are starting to question that a bit. Overall, for the deaf and hard of hearing population, there is some limited effectiveness there, and particularly in comparison to the low frequency and the results of the bed shaker. So in terms of consequence, though, depending on the flashing frequency, there is a concern with the use of this on all at-risk populations because it could induce epileptic seizures or disorientation in some populations. So some considerations there. So a couple studies here covered on this slide. Again, these are a bit older studies, but Nover investigated a 100 candela strobe with a frequency of about 75 flashes per minute. It didn't control for sleep stage, but it did report a 92% effectiveness among 12 deaf adults. A UL study showed some similar results, really. So there's 22 people with who were deaf between 20 and 65, a large age range there. 58 students who were deaf aged 13 to 19, so more children, and then 14 students who were deaf aged 10 to 12. And then some other medicated adults were analyzed as a comparison as well. The study utilized a strobe with an intensity of 110 candela and a flashing frequency of 1 hertz. So the reported effectiveness from this was 100% for the deaf adults and 91% for the older students, that second age range 13 to 19, 86% for the children aged 10 to 12, and 28% for the medicated, mental changes there. So this was quite surprising, 100% for the adults. Some of the other studies, this was a bit older research. Some of the more frequent studies are starting to see some different results. So I'll present those. This study here, this one was done by DeVois and Ashley and Clausen in 2005. But a strobe with 110 candela and a flashing frequency of 1 hertz, so similar to the previous study. That's all in line with contemporary regulations and legislation. The sleep stage was controlled for, and the participants were woken from various stages of sleep, so 2, 3, 4, or REM sleep. And then 3 different groups were studied, so 35 deaf adults, 29 hard of hearing, and 31 able hearing, so without hearing loss. So looking at this for the deaf adults, it does show a bit of different results from the previous studies, with 57% effectiveness for the deaf adults, 34% effectiveness for hard of hearing, and adults without hearing loss still 32%. So fairly middle of the road of effectiveness there, but much lower than some of the others that have been shown. Strobe waking effectiveness here from a study from Bowman. This again is an older study from 1995, but it continued the research on strobes, investigating the effectiveness of 75 candela, and you can see the different criteria there, but it was placed 75 centimeters from the pillow. So this is something that is a factor that really plays a lot into the overall effectiveness, and those details weren't always fully available in all of the studies for comparison purposes. But this one was a study on fully hearing females over the age of 18. They controlled the sleep stage, but this one kind of contradicts those earlier studies. Again, this isn't a deaf or hard of hearing population, but for able hearing adults from a REM sleep, the waking effectiveness was quite low, 35% from being woken from a stage 3 or 4 sleep, and 45% from a REM sleep. So again, the data there is a bit variable. Another one here, this one was testing strobes with intensities exceeding the 72 requirements at the time, with an intensity of 177 candela, 210 and 420, just to see the results of that, with a flashing frequency of 2 hertz in a T3 pattern. There's 38 participants involved, all had hearing loss between 25 and 70 dB. They did control the sleep stage, so it was participants either in stage 3 or 4 sleep. And with the 177 candela strobe, about 27% woke to that. At the intermediate interval, the 210 candela, so that woke above that benchmark, was about 29%, so 11 additional participants. But then 16 of the 37s, about 43%, still slept through, the highest intensity strobe there. So a bit more to support some of, there's kind of 2 camps of findings here, but this was conducted in 2007 by Bruck and Thomas. And then a bit more, so this is some more work done by Brian. 19 subjects were all profoundly deaf, exposed to that higher threshold, the 177 candela strobe, mounted 3 feet from the pillow. And here, we see, kind of going back to those earlier studies, we see 100% effectiveness from the strobe light. And the study found that all awoke from REM sleep when exposed to the strobe, and comparing that to the voice alarm, for the deaf, no surprise, there was very limited wakefulness from the voice alarm, but the bed shaker also showed 100% waking effectiveness from that as well. But there is kind of a caveat to this data. So when you look at those same that same data, right, comparing the voice alarm, bed shaker, and strobe light, what we see is the waking time is where we see a significant difference. So even though the study did show that the strobe was effective at that 177 candela, there was a significant difference in waking reaction time between the different devices for deaf participants, and it was significantly longer for strobes and voice alarms in comparison to the bed shaker. So you see that maximum waking time of being around 180 seconds, where the maximum time from the bed shaker results was around 37 seconds. So pretty significant difference there, and is definitely a factor that needs to be accounted for in the overall analysis of this. So kind of bringing this back together, this is a study that kind of compared all of these together. So the main ones that we looked at, the high frequency, the low frequency, bed, pillow shaker, and strobe lights. What you see, at that core threshold that's in the codes and standards, the 520 hertz low frequency square wave did overall have the greatest waking effectiveness. And that's really true across all populations and disabilities. So whether it's deaf and hard of hearing, alcohol impaired, able hearing, older adults, younger adults, overall that effectiveness for that technology through all of the studies that have been done is appearing to kind of emerge as the top in terms of overall effectiveness. So you look here, suggested effectiveness of all of these different technologies that were analyzed, kind of what is the strength of evidence, and then is there anything that it's not suitable for? So you can really see from all of these, it varies a bit, but the relative effectiveness of the low frequency alarm is high, and the evidence to support that is very strong as well. It's also high for the bed shaker and pillow shaker, but the evidence, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done on that, particularly in controlling the vibration and different things like that. So the only kind of downside is the low frequency is less suitable for the deaf population, but again, it still has many advantages over many of the other technologies. Bed shakers, its downside was, for older adults, right? So there's a trade-off there, but there's more information on this in the results. So as part of this study, we did do a survey of folks that were deaf and hard of hearing, and also caretakers of them or educators that recommend these technologies. So what was interesting was, what was most commonly used by these populations of those that responded was the strobe light, and the low frequency alarm was pretty far down that list. So, from the technological perspective, why that may be, but I did find it interesting that the strobe light, which had some varying effectiveness, did actually appear to be what was most used. So just reading this, the gray is, what was most used, and then to the scale of the red, which is, I've never heard of it. And then in terms of those that are recommended by support persons or educators, bed and pillow shakers are the most recommended, followed by strobe light. So low frequency isn't really getting into that mix when you look at overall. Again, this was a fairly limited survey through this study, but it is insightful information. So a couple just high-level observations. The high-frequency smoke alarms do seem to be inefficient for waking people who are deaf and hard of hearing, and other vulnerable populations as well. The low-frequency audible alarms are the most effective for people who are hard of hearing and for older age groups. The recommendation of strobes as an alternative alarm technology for waking people who are deaf and hard of hearing. We need to do some more evaluations and more studies on this. As I said, there is some positive results coming out of it, but there's also data that completely contradicts that. So before we continue kind of pushing those for those technologies, I think there is more research and studies that need to be done on that. The bed and pillow shakers, they could be effective for people who are hard of hearing or deaf, but more work is needed on standardized measurement of vibration capabilities. There is the researchers that did this work at Lund University. There is another paper that's come out where they've taken a step forward on that. So I can provide resources for that as well, but that more work is needed in that area. So from the survey, people who are deaf or hard of hearing do not necessarily commonly use devices that are showing the strongest effectiveness. So some of the support persons or fire safety experts who might be recommending technologies that have been proven ineffective in the literature. So I think we need to really take a look at that and what the evidence is behind, the recommendations. And then those who were deaf or hard of hearing that responded to this survey, they indicated that oftentimes that they rely on hotel or lodging establishments to provide an appropriate alarm technology for them. But we need to do some additional work and study on, what devices are being provided in these establishments if they're asked for or needed. So a bit more work is needed on that front as well. So there's some next steps in terms of outreach and advocacy. I think we need to, have some targeted campaigns towards some of these groups that are working with these communities and be cautious about what we're recommending and what we still need to figure out before these are viable solutions. Then from a research perspective, again, focusing on some of those vibrations in the bed shakers, also looking at, work in hotels. And then the new technologies like wearable devices, those need to be further investigated. We can't really comment on their effectiveness for waking these populations at this time. But there is a need in the standards world for alarm technologies incorporating those tactile signals. We do need to make some advancements in the standards world from that perspective. So here, this is the final report from this study. So feel free to scan this QR code to download the report if you're interested. You can also go to nfpa.org/foundation. There's a big button there to click reports and projects. You can filter for the detection portfolio. So to see the other work that's going on. But here's the QR code for this specific report. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. So here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out anytime if you have questions on this or anything else related to our detection portfolio. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. This has been some great information. We do have a couple of questions in the queue that I want to kind of touch base on. A couple was asking for manufacturer recommendations on the various types and such, and it's probably not something we're going to dive into and naming a specific manufacturer, but my quick Google search and Amazon search found multiple resources available with different manufacturers that whether you're recommending them or buying yourselves, you can gain access to. But I do have a couple follow-up questions that I think you brought out some really good stuff, and I may do these in reverse actually. So starting at the end of your presentation. Your training outreach, at the end there, I think is really a critical piece. And how best do we make that next step to educating the fire service? How do we get this message out from, the research group to the code compliance people out to the fire station, to the people who are, dealing with the general public? Because I think that may drive that gap that you just identified in why the recommendation for strobe compared to low frequency. So you have any insight on that?
Yeah, so when we wrapped up this project, the following cycle for Fire Prevention Week at NFPA was focused on some of these at-risk populations. So we did make sure that we, passed this research on to them and working with them to create resources for these populations and integrating some of those results in that they can be shared with educators. But there does need to continue to be, that was one thing that we specifically did as a result of this project, but I think those need to continue. Oftentimes you complete work and then you pass it on and you don't always follow up. That needs to be a continuous conversation because it needs to be continually reiterated, and we need to keep updating that research so that we make sure that we're really pushing what is effective. And not just, what we think may be effective, right? Because there's limitations, and while there's, some may be effective, there's some other variables that we need to give context to in terms of how they can communicate with communities. So I think, partnering with IAFC on this, and how we can better work with the fire service on some of these points and what groups, to present to. We do try to present this research at different, conferences and events to spread the word, but we can definitely use support from your all's communities to help us do that. And just working with platforms and existing mediums that we have, like Fire Prevention Week, is a great way to get a broad message out, but it's a continual effort.
No, thanks. Good suggestions. So as we looked at the next piece here for this, you identified the disparity between recommending of the strobe light as a device and the low frequency alarm. And it kind of dawned on me as I was listening in and, reading through all this, that is this more of just a lack of knowledge by those making recommendations about the low frequency alarms?
I think that, and then also kind of, there was some challenges with, and prevalence in the market as well in comparison to, what's typically installed. I think that was a barrier as well, but we also saw that in the survey, right? The folks who were actually deaf or hard of hearing, fewer of them knew about that as an option for them. So I think there needs to be work in terms of, the capabilities. There has been a lot of research, but it may not be communicated. But there was, limitations in terms of being able to do it, the sound pressure level that was needed on battery power. So I think that has played into it a bit. But I think there's just more communication in terms of how much more effective it's turning out to be, and how we can make that work and make it more broadly accessible.
No, that's really great. And understanding those barriers, I think, then helps to drive the facilitators to understand the newer components that are out there. So it goes back to my first question about education and training. So no, I think that's great. So the other question I really was interested in knowing, and maybe you can provide the group some insight. What's next on the horizon? Where are we going with these technologies? Obviously, low frequency is relatively new. It's been out there for a while, but relatively new and coming to the market. What are the next devices that we're going to help those populations that are affected? And then within that same question about populations, are there any real demographic data points to point us to where we should focus more efforts on, in addition to the hearing impaired and deaf populations? Are there other more specific demographics that we should be looking at?
Yeah, so starting with the technology piece, from our research perspective, I mean, there's a lot of evidence, and the low frequency, I see that really starting to grow because that's really the most broadly effective. So I think that is really on the right track. The bed and pillow shakers, that's probably the next thing that has fairly equivalent effectiveness, particularly on deaf and hard of hearing populations. But where we saw inconsistency there was in kind of a standardized vibration for the testing. And there needs to be more regulation on that. So I can put in, Lund University, our researchers on this in RICO, they've continued to do some work trying to develop that side of things a bit, but still more work is needed to be done on that. And then the second side of your question was on populations. I'm trying to remember the second piece of that. Which populations do we need to focus on?
Sorry, I have two questions together on you. So it's more about we know who the community is at risk, but within that community of risk, are there more specific populations that we should be looking at? Certain areas of the country, certain demographics, who's more at risk, and where should we, what recommendation could be made to focus efforts in those areas?
Yeah, so I don't know that I have a specific answer to that, but I can say that one area that we're starting to focus on a bit more, and we have some studies that we're trying to get underway, is focusing a bit more on the autistic community. There's really a big uptick in the presence of those at varying scales, and we all know, the effect of alarms on those populations is particularly challenging. So I think, and those are difficult to conduct from a testing perspective, but we are trying to look at how we can do more research on that population, because they're one of the most vulnerable. We feel the percentage of them is really increasing, and they're the ones that can have adverse reactions to some of these alarms. So I think that's kind of the next layer that we're trying to focus on, and understanding, what can trigger, the pauses between the tones. What impact does that have in terms of making you think there's not an emergency, or allowing them to come down. So that's something that we're really focused on as the next step, as a population that we need to do more work on, as it's becoming kind of more and more urgent.
No, that's exactly, you answered my question perfectly, because I think that tied in the future technology, development, and the populations at risk. So this has been a great event. I'd like to thank you and the NFPA Research Foundation for today's participation, and all the people that were on the event today. This is going really great. And again, this is part of one of a series of 4, and then that's going to culminate in a 2-day pre-conference event at the Community Risk Reduction Conference. So this information helps us build upon, what those next steps are, and when we gather those experts to work on this. And we're really happy the National Home Builders are, collaborating with us as part of that, because it needs a collaboration effort. For those, so I'll give you the last closing comments, and then I'll wrap it up for today. So over to you, Victoria.
Yes, I thank you for your attendance today. I appreciate those of you that have joined, and I hope this is helpful for the overall conference. I'm sure that'll be a great learning experience. If you're attending that conference as well, please feel free, with all the information and knowledge that's shared in this forum. The foundation is always accepting research ideas year-round. So we encourage you, as if there's any questions you have as a follow-up to this, feel free to reach out to me, or to reach out to the foundation in general. If it's a separate subject, this is what we're here for, to really do research that can help drive us forward on the challenges of the industry. So encourage you to reach out with us, and look forward to working with you. And I hope you have a great event in Arizona.
No, thank you. Can you answer one more question that just popped in?
Oh, sure.
Sure. So this is a good question. It deals with the effectiveness of smoke alarms with voice activation, and does that gentle wake voice methodology work within this framework?
So I think there's a liability there in terms of what their hearing loss level is, and the deaf. Typically, it's not as effective on those populations, but I'd have to dig a little deeper to get any core results. If you happen to scan the QR code to our detection portfolio earlier on, there's a lot of studies that you can dig into that have looked at that in comparison, but I don't have numbers I can pull off the top of my head. But typically for the deaf and hard of hearing populations, those haven't been as effective, but there is, for the autistic populations, those do seem to have some more support on that, things that aren't, as jarring. But again, we need to do a bit more on that. There is some work on autistic populations I can refer you to as well. So you can feel free to reach out to me on that.
Great. So what we'll do here for everyone that's on this call today, we're building a landing page with this information. The recording of the webinar is going to be available. You'll receive a link today about the session, in addition to a brief survey as we close out today. So please help us, help others gain more information as we move forward. And again, I'd like to thank Victoria and the Research Foundation for everything they've presented today. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next event or the next webinar. And again, there are 3 more webinars coming up in different specialty areas, all focusing on this important topic. So in closing, thanks on behalf of the International Association of Fire Chiefs, and please have a nice, safe day, and check your smoke alarm.
Thank you.